Greetings to you, brothers and sisters in the struggle. My name is Dr. Gabriel Selassie I, and I'm bringing you another edition of Revolutionary History. Today's topic that I'm going to discuss is something that I've been seeing quite a bit on Facebook and also floating around in other areas, and I get quite a number of questions from my students as we're making our progression through Black studies or African American history. I always get a lot of questions about how we actually can determine whether or not the ancient Egyptians were in fact black. This may sound to you somewhat quite startling since we fundamentally know that the geography of Egypt and ancient Egypt was in fact on the continent of Africa, and Egypt today, as a modern nation, is still located in its same region. This is barring the idea that sometimes nation states have over our course of spans of history have moved relative positions around the African continent and the European continent as well. But the question that is really out there for us, and I think is a very, very interesting one, is how do we today, without having the mummified bodies intact, where we can determine things like skin color, or even to the degree where we can run DNA on these bodies that have degraded to the point where the DNA is no longer pullable from these bodies, or there's just really no other scientific way to do that. And one of the most interesting ways that we historians and, of course, anthropologists have been able to rely on is something that has come out of Europe from at least the 17th century. There's always been, at least before the 17th century and the 18th century, there have always been ways in which people have kind of demarcated the other, those individuals who are not part of their own particular collective body. And they've done this in two particular ways. And one of them was, of course, with language. And the other one, of course, is physical features. Now, the idea of using language is problematic for us because obviously the ancient Egyptians are no longer with us, and so we can't discern anything from their language. All we have is the rudiments of their hieroglyphics, which today we, by and large, still haven't been able to discern fully. We're able to read hieroglyphics, but their real relevant meanings are somewhat lost to us, and we still don't have a code or a codex that allows us to break those down. But what I'm going to do is talk about one, why it's important to establish whether or not the ancient Egyptians were in fact black, how ancient Egypt itself was essentially pulled out of Africa, and the ways that we can go about rediscovering why or how and the overall race of these ancient Egyptians. And it's something that I think is really important and really fascinating. First, the thing that we must understand is that while Europeans were out discovering the world, and this was a time period of the Age of Discovery, which really began in the 1400s with the rise of Portugal as a maritime nation. And if you're interested in this, you can always research Prince Henry the Navigator, who was a prince in Portugal who really founded a navigational school in Sagres, Portugal, that enabled the Portuguese to really discover new methods of navigation on sea, looking at old maps, discerning old maps, and trying to piece together for themselves what the known world or non-known world really looked like. But really, we start getting these conceptions about other groups of people as the Portuguese began to explore. But as we begin this, it was very important for natural historians, European natural historians who were coming out of this milieu, to really grapple with the idea that maybe perhaps Europe wasn't as advanced as they had once believed as they began to discover these other ancient civilizations. Now, the idea that Europeans were startled by the advancement of these other cultures, just something that's not really taught in textbooks. But this is one of the areas that a lot of Europeans discussed, and you can read any of the Spanish conquest um, journals where they do talk about how even in Mesoamerica, how advanced those Mesoamerican civilizations were. And the same thing happened in Africa. As Europeans began to discover territory and different people in Africa, they began to really conceptualize the idea that there were other civilizations who had made advancements. So why this is important is because as Europeans began to really explore Africa well, they began to do a number of things, but one thing that became very important to them was the taking of slaves. Now, the problem with the taking of slaves by Europeans is that people understood fundamentally that it was probably morally wrong to enslave other people. Europeans fundamentally understood that they didn't themselves want to be enslaved and have to work for other people. But the idea of enslaving other people, if you could demonstrate that that group of people were in fact a lesser people or not quite on the same level as Europeans themselves, then perhaps from a moral standpoint, you could make the argument that what you're going to do with these lesser groups, whether they be Mesoamericans or Africans, is bring them civilization. But it's fundamentally problematic if you go to these continents and you discover that these people might in fact be more advanced or more civilized than yourselves. Then how are you going to make the argument that enslavement of these people can be justified on moral grounds when they in fact might be much more advanced than you are? So, for example, in the case of Egypt, we see, and Europeans understood, grand monument building. Well, how can a people that you've been enslaving be responsible for the building of grand monuments and temples and understood fundamentally how to read the stars, to do complex mathematics, and do perform surgery, etc., and had a fundamentally advanced theology? How, in fact, could you make that argument? Well, the most logical way to do this is to pull these people out of Africa. And so you begin to see through racial science from at least the 1700s onward the slow degradation in European writing that asserted that, in fact, Egyptians were not, in fact, black people, but they were, in fact, a lost tribe of Caucasians, or they were some type of form of white people that, in fact, had settled from Eurasia into Egypt and dominated black people, made them slaves, and they established a form of white civilization. So the fundamental goal here by Europeans was, again, to pull Egypt out of Africa and to assert the idea that, in fact, Egyptians were, in fact, not black people. So how did they do this? One of the ways in which they did this is that when they went into these African or Egyptian monuments, they began to explore the hieroglyphics, and they did see on some occasions some white Egyptians, actual paintings, hieroglyphs of white skinned or painted white depictions of Egyptians, and they contrasted those with depictions of um, captured warriors or, in fact, servants who had black skin. So they were then able to make the argument that based on physical features, some, in fact, um, uh, or Egyptians themselves were, in fact, white people, and that their slaves were black people. Now, this wasn't the entire case. We know from history that on some occasions that Egyptian society, during some epochs, Egyptian society was a multicultural society, to the degree that there were some people who had control of Egypt or who had risen to power in Egypt that could be discerned as not being quote unquote black. This is not something that anthropologists or historians like myself really lose a lot of sleep over. It would be the equivalent of saying that just because we have one black president, then every single black president or every single president in the United States, therefore, is black. No, there were some occasions when you did have people who might have had non black looking skin who were depicted as being white, who rose to be pharaoh. So that's nothing to lose sleep over. So the way that basically that modern day historians and modern day anthropologists try to discern if they try to do this at all, discern whether or not Egyptians were in fact black is what we call the somatic norm image. And what somatic means is, of course, pertaining to the body. So the way that this is achieved is by looking at the somatic norm image, and we can do this typically through monuments of pharaohs and their queens or queens that ruled Egypt, and looking at their physical features and discerning whether or not these individuals were white or black. So the basic bottom line in a rather crude way is to say whomever has features that are black is probably black, and who has physical features that are white is probably also white. Now, this doesn't hold fundamentally for in every single case, but on most occasions, it usually occurs. So, for example, I know that many of you probably have some friends who are quote unquote black, but they have what they call very fine features, and yet they still are black people. But nevertheless, the theory, the somatic norm image, is still an application that is used widely. So what we do is we look at what we call the somatic norm image of these monuments to discern whether or not the pharaohs or people in Egypt were in fact black or ruled by blacks. And I'm going to at least show a couple of depictions where you can see and how this makes sense. The first of these depictions comes from a book that's called, and I don't know if you can see this rather clearly, it looks like the sun is shining on it, but I'll try to tilt it in a way where you can see it. But it is Black Folk Here and There by St. Clair Drake. And here is a wonderful depiction towards the bottom where it actually shows a depiction of a darker skinned Egyptian being courted by some rather light skinned Egyptians. Now, that is one way that we can discern who's black, but the most prominent way, again, is through what we call the somatic norm image. And by the way, I'll return to these books towards the end of this sort of mini lecture here, and I'll also talk about another book that's very important as well. But for now, let's take a look at some examples where we have. Here is one of Mycerinos, who is the 4th dynasty king, and this is a depiction, and I'll try to hold this up where you can see it rather clearly. And here it is right here where we can see clearly the nose and the features, the lips, and the head and the eyes of that individual there. And we can clearly see that that individual, through the somatic norm image, would have been classified as a black person. The next image that we have is the 4th dynasty princess of the wife of Cheops, who reigned also within the 4th dynasty. So the Egyptians made a bust of this woman who was married to Cheops, and here is her bust. Now, if you look at this, if you saw this woman walking on the streets of, say, Chicago or Los Angeles, Watts, Los Angeles or Compton, you would steadily recognize this person as being a black person. That is what we call the somatic norm image, and Egyptian history is replete with them. Here is Sesostris I, who was depicted as being Osiris, holding the Ankh, the double Ankh. And I'll move in just a little bit closer so you can see that depiction. Clearly a black person. We also have Tutmos the second, or Amenhotep the third. Clearly from this is a person of African ancestry. We can tell by looking at the nose and the lips and the shape of the eyes. Here is one that is also very famous, and this one is an unknown black man in Egypt. And as you can see from the lips and the nose, this person would literally could resemble someone like Scottie Pippen, who played for the Chicago Bulls. Obviously, a black man. And this goes on and on. We can see depictions of Akhenaten, a young black person, clearly demarcated through the somatic norm image as black. Now, just by looking at those, you can obviously tell that these individuals were of African descent. So when people argue with you and they try to convince you that Egyptians were not black, the best thing to do is use the somatic norm image. And why the somatic norm image is because the somatic norm image was used by Europeans to demarcate themselves as not being black. So really what we're doing is we're taking a European process of demarcating individuals based on their physical features and turning it around and using that to apply to show that there were in fact black people who dominated Egyptian civilization and built Egyptian culture. Now, the first book that I showed you, of course, was St. Clair Drake's Black Folk Here and There. And this is one of the most understudied and underknown books in anthropology, sociology, and history. Part of the reason why this book is relatively unknown and not really taught on the university level, and certainly not taught out of anywhere at the high school level, is because this book literally was very difficult for a lot of people to comprehend, in the sense that it upset a lot of individuals' notions about the idea of racism and where racism came from. Drake posits that the transatlantic slave trade was largely responsible for the creation of white racism and the denigration of black people. The second book, which is really a powerful book, and I read this during my first semester in graduate school, way back when dinosaurs ruled the earth, rather obviously, but this one is Sheikh Anta Diop's The African Origin of Civilization. This book is a really fascinating book where Sheikh Anta Diop, who was a Senegalese Egyptologist, wrote this book, The Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality, where he literally goes piece by piece and describes and shows how African origins are what responsible for the building of Egyptian civilization. So if you're really interested in making those very fine arguments and very fine points about whether or not Egypt was in fact a African oriented civilization, I recommend these books. I recommend that you read Sheikh Anta Diop's book first, and then move on to St. Clair Drake's book second. And you can get these books used on Amazon for a couple of bucks. I recommend that you get Black Folk Here and There as new, and look for Sheikh Anta Diop's book as used. You can probably find that for little or no money. But that's essentially the best way and the most productive way that you can discern whether or not the Egyptian civilization was in fact a African or quite poignantly a black African civilization. All right, so if you have any questions, you can easily find me on my Facebook page, W. Gabriel Selassie I. I am the revolutionary historian.